Story 1. George Alaric Jones was born on April 10, 1974, in Dallas, Texas. He was the son of Annie Jones and George J. Jones. His parents raised him in a neighborhood in South Dallas. He grew up in that area with his brothers and sisters. His family was stable and provided for him. Later in life, his defense lawyer would say that George came from a good family and that he never wanted for anything. His parents cared about him and tried to give him a normal upbringing. As a child, George attended school in the Dallas area. He went to school for 11 years. However, he did not finish his education. He left school before completing the 12th grade. He never earned a high school diploma. After he stopped going to school, George needed to find a way to make money. He found work as a hairstylist. This was his main profession for some time. He also became involved in selling drugs. He later admitted that he was a drug dealer at certain points in his life. This was a part of his daily activities, but it was not something that led him into trouble with the law in a serious way at that time. George was a young man with regular interests and habits. He enjoyed playing basketball. He also liked to work out and keep his body in good shape. He listened to many types of music, but his favorite styles were jazz and R&B. When he was not active, he liked to read books. He had a special interest in gangster stories. He was fascinated by stories about organized crime and the so-called underworld. This was just a personal interest, but it showed that he was drawn to stories about criminals and their secret world. He also described himself as an open and honest person, and he said he would always be truthful with people he met. George had friends and spent time with other young people in his neighborhood. He wanted to fit in with others. His defense lawyer later explained that George was acting out in order to fit in with the wrong crowd. This meant that he sometimes made poor choices because he wanted to be accepted by certain groups of people. He was not known to have a prior prison record before the events that would later change his life. He had never been sent to prison for any crime before. He lived at home with his parents, and he continued to live in South Dallas as a young adult. He worked, he sold drugs on the side, and he spent time with his friends. He was a young man who had not yet faced any major legal consequences for his actions. As he grew older, George continued to live a fairly ordinary life in his neighborhood. He stayed close to his family. He had relationships with people around him. He did not have any major mental health problems that were documented. Later in life, his lawyers would try to argue that he was mentally impaired, but that claim was not accepted by the courts. During his early years, there was no clear sign that he would become involved in a violent crime. He simply made bad decisions about who he spent time with and how he earned money. He was known to carry a gun at times, which was not unusual in his environment, but this did not immediately lead to any arrests. His life was a mix of normal activities and small-time illegal behavior. He was still living with his parents, and he had not yet been caught for anything serious. Then, in April 1993, his life took a sharp turn. But before that turn, he was just a young man from Dallas who had dropped out of school, worked as a hairstylist, sold drugs, and spent his free time playing basketball, listening to music, and reading gangster books. On the afternoon of April 13, 1993, George Jones was with a group of people in Dallas, Texas. He was with Derek Rogers, who he had known for over 2 years. There were also 2 other people with them. The group decided to go to a shopping mall in Dallas. Their purpose was to find someone they could rob. They drove to the mall and parked in the lot. They watched people coming and going from the mall. At the mall, they saw a young man get out of a white car and walk into the building. The man's name was Forrest J. Hall. He was 22 years old and worked at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The group noticed Hall and his car. They decided that Hall would be their target. They waited for him to come back out. When Hall finished his shopping and returned to his car, Jones and Rogers approached him. Jones was carrying a .380 automatic pistol. They forced Hall into his own car. Hall had no choice but to obey because Jones had the gun pointed at him. Jones got into the driver's seat of Hall's car. Rogers also got into the car. Hall was forced to stay in the vehicle. The other two people who were with them followed in a separate car. Jones drove Hall's white car away from the mall and headed toward a secluded road in South Dallas. The road was quiet and away from other people. The others followed behind them in their own car. When they reached the secluded road, Jones stopped the car. He ordered Hall to get out. Hall stepped out of the vehicle. At this point, he had his hands raised in the air because Jones was still holding the gun on him. Jones then ordered Hall to lie down on the grass. Hall obeyed and lay face down on the ground. Once Hall was lying down, Jones shot him twice in the back of the head. The shots were fired from very close range. Hall died immediately. The two spent shell casings from the gun were left on the ground near his body. After the shooting, Jones and Rogers took Hall's car and drove away. They left Hall's body in the ditch alongside the road. They drove to a nearby McDonald's restaurant, where they met up with the two other people who had followed them. Later, Jones and Rogers took Hall's car and stripped it. They removed the tires and the rims. They also took out the car stereo and the speakers. Jones kept the stereo and speakers at his house. He took the tires and rims to a pawn shop and sold them. He signed the pawn slip with his name. The next day, on April 14, 1993, Dallas police officers found Hall's car abandoned on a street near Fair Park in Dallas. The car was empty. It had been completely stripped of its tires, rims, stereo, and speakers. Hall's body had already been found the day before by someone who saw it in the ditch. The police had recovered the two shell casings near the body. Within a week of the murder, a Lancaster patrolman was chasing a stolen car. The person driving that stolen car left the vehicle and ran away on foot. The patrolman searched the abandoned stolen car and found a .380 automatic pistol inside. That pistol was later tested and confirmed to be the exact same weapon that had been used to kill Forrest Hall. At that time, however, the police did not yet know who had used that gun. They did not immediately connect it to George Jones. 5 months after Hall was killed, George Jones was involved in another violent crime. In September 1993, Jones and another person kidnapped a young woman named Kendra Buckner. She was 20 years old. They took her to a secluded spot. They forced her to take off all her clothes. They searched through her purse. Then they shot her twice in the head. After they shot her, they feared that she might not be dead. So they went back to the spot later and shot her again in the face, this time with a shotgun. To cover up what they had done, they also burned the car that was connected to the crime. Kendra Buckner died from her injuries. At the time of Hall's murder, Roger's girlfriend had been present during part of the events. She saw Jones with the gun force Hall into his car at the mall. She also followed them to the secluded road. She saw Hall get out of the car with his hands up and Jones holding the gun on him. As she drove away, she heard 2 gunshots. Later, she asked Jones why he had killed Hall. Jones gave her an answer. He said he killed Hall so that Hall would not get to see his son. That was the reason Jones gave for the murder. He did not want the victim to be able to see his child again. At that point, no one in law enforcement had yet arrested Jones or even questioned him about Hall's murder. The police were still trying to figure out who was responsible. They had found the body, the shell casings, the abandoned car, and the gun, but they had not yet linked those items to George Jones. On September 23, 1993, 5 months after Forrest Hall was killed, Derek Rogers went to the Dallas Police Department. He spoke with detectives and also with a special agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Rogers gave a full confession. He admitted that he and Jones had gone to the mall to rob someone and that Jones had shot Hall. Rogers put his confession in writing voluntarily. This was the first time that law enforcement had a clear suspect in Hall's murder. Based on Rogers' statement, the detectives now knew that George Jones was the shooter. They obtained a warrant for his arrest. The detectives went to Jones' home in South Dallas. He was living there with his parents. They arrested him at the house. After the arrest, Jones was taken to the police station for questioning. Within hours of his arrest, Jones gave his own written statement. The statement was 3 pages long. In it, he admitted that he had been involved in the murder. However, his version of events was different from Rogers'. Jones claimed that he had only shot Hall once, and that it was an accident. He also said he shot in self-defense. He blamed Rogers for the actual killing. Despite this attempt to shift blame, Jones did admit that the car stereo and speakers found in his house belonged to Hall. He also admitted that he had pawned the tires and rims from Hall's car at a nearby pawn shop. The police found the pawn slip. A forensic document examiner looked at the signature on the pawn slip and confirmed that it was, in fact, Jones' signature. Jones later claimed that his confession was not true. He said that the police had written the confession for him and that he was forced to sign it. His lawyers challenged this at trial, but the judge allowed the confession to be presented as evidence. The jury heard the confession along with all the other evidence. The trial took place in Dallas County. It began in March 1995. The prosecution presented the case against Jones. Derek Rogers was the main witness. He testified about everything that happened on April 13, 1993. He told the jury how he and Jones went to the mall, how they targeted Hall, how Jones forced Hall into the car, how they drove to the secluded road, and how Jones shot Hall twice in the head. Rogers' girlfriend also testified. She confirmed that she saw Jones with the gun, that she saw Hall being forced into the car, and that she saw Hall with his hands up as Jones held the gun on him. She also confirmed that she heard 2 gunshots, and that later Jones told her he killed Hall so Hall would not see his son. The prosecution also presented the pawn slip with Jones' signature and the testimony of the forensic document examiner. The jury also heard evidence about other crimes Jones had committed. They learned that Jones had participated in at least 5 other aggravated robberies. These robberies followed a similar pattern. Jones and others would confront a victim in public, use a weapon, and steal the victim's car. The cars were often stripped for parts. The jury also heard about the murder of Kendra Buckner. They were told that Jones and another person had kidnapped her, shot her twice in the head, later shot her in the face with a shotgun, and burned the car to hide the crime. This happened 5 months after Hall's murder. On March 22, 1995, the jury found George Ulrich Jones guilty of capital murder. Under Texas law, capital murder is a crime that can carry the death penalty. The same jury then had to decide his punishment. They answered the special questions required for a death sentence. Based on their answers, the judge was required to sentence Jones to death. He was sent to death row in Texas. After the trial, Jones began the appeals process. His conviction and death sentence were automatically appealed to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. On September 16, 1998, that court affirmed his conviction and sentence. The court found that there had been an error in removing one potential juror during jury selection, but it decided that this error was not serious enough to overturn the conviction. Jones then filed a motion for rehearing, but it was denied on December 9, 1998. He then asked the United States Supreme Court to review his case. The Supreme Court denied his request on November 8, 1999. Jones also filed a state habeas corpus petition. This is a request to challenge the legality of his imprisonment. The trial court reviewed the petition and recommended that it be denied. On September 13, 2000, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed and denied Jones relief. He then filed a federal habeas corpus petition in a federal district court in Dallas. The district court denied his petition on July 23, 2003. Jones appealed that decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. On June 24, 2004, the Fifth Circuit denied his appeal. The United States Supreme Court denied his final request for review on January 10, 2005. On January 12, 2005, Jones filed a second state habeas petition. This time, he argued that he was mentally retarded and therefore could not be executed. He argued that the Constitution barred the execution of people with mental retardation. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay of execution to examine this claim. They sent the case back to the trial court for review. The trial court examined the evidence and concluded that Jones was not mentally retarded. On February 24, 2010, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed with the trial court and denied relief. Jones did not appeal this decision to the Supreme Court. With all appeals exhausted, Jones' execution was scheduled for June 2, 2010. On that day, he was taken to the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. He was given a final meal. He chose pizza, oatmeal cookies, French fries, and sweet tea. None of his family members came to witness the execution. However, relatives of Forrest Hall were present and watched through a window. Kendra Buckner's brother and sister also watched. Jones made a final statement. He expressed love for his parents and his brothers and sisters. He then spoke directly to Hall's family. He told them that he hoped his death would bring them closure or some kind of peace. He said he hoped it would help Hall's family, his son, and his loved ones. He said that his journey had been a long one and that he had gained enlightenment. He then said that death was not the end, but only the beginning. After he finished his statement, the lethal injection was started. The drugs began to flow into his body. A tattoo on his right arm spelled the word killer. He gasped, made loud snores, and then stopped breathing. He was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. on June 2, 2010. After the execution, Hall's uncles spoke to the media. They said the situation was bitter. They thanked God for the day and asked for God's mercy upon Jones' mother. One uncle said that the execution brought justice but seemed too easy because Jones died peacefully while his nephew had suffered greatly. He also said that even after 17 years, his nephew's murder felt as fresh as the day it happened. Derek Rogers, the accomplice who confessed and testified against Jones, did not receive the death penalty. He made a plea bargain with the prosecutors. He agreed to plead guilty to aggravated robbery, a lesser charge, in exchange for his testimony. He received a sentence of 22 years in prison. He was not charged with murder because he cooperated with the state. Forrest Hall was buried, and his family continued to mourn him. George Alaric Jones was executed, and the state of Texas carried out its sentence. The story of George Alaric Jones ends with his execution on June 2, 2010, and the case was closed. Story 2. Melbert Ray Ford Jr. was born on December 9, 1960, in the state of Georgia. He was the son of Melbert Ray Ford Sr. His father struggled with alcohol addiction for many years. His father also used pain medications in a way that was harmful to his health. Because of these problems, Ford grew up in a home that was not always stable. The family had financial difficulties, and there was a lot of stress in the household. This kind of environment affected Ford from a very young age. As a child, Ford showed signs of emotional and behavioral problems. He had trouble controlling his anger and impulses. His parents noticed these issues and tried to get him help. They took him to school counselors and to mental health professionals. When he was in high school, his behavior became worse. He dropped out of school and was admitted to Central State Hospital for a 2-week stay. There, doctors examined him and gave him a diagnosis. They said he had residual attention deficit disorder, which meant he still had some problems with focus and attention from childhood. They also said he had antisocial personality disorder. This diagnosis meant that he had difficulty following rules and controlling his emotions. The doctors explained that people with this disorder often feel anger building up inside them like water boiling in a pot, and sometimes that anger bursts out in a way they cannot stop. Ford also had physical health problems. He suffered from severe headaches that came and went without warning. He had asthma, which made it hard for him to breathe at times. He had allergies that caused him discomfort. He took medications for these conditions, but some of these medications had side effects that affected his mood and his thinking. Despite these struggles, people who knew Ford described him as having a caring side. He was not always angry or difficult. His family members said he could be kind and thoughtful. When Ford was a teenager and into his early 20s, he began using alcohol and drugs. He drank alcohol heavily and used marijuana. This made his emotional problems worse. The alcohol and drugs intensified his depression and made it harder for him to control his impulses. He was not able to hold down a steady job for a long time. He moved from one job to another and did not have a clear direction in his life. In 1978, when Ford was 17 years old, he got into trouble with the law. He was convicted in Cobb County, Georgia, of making terroristic threats and acts. This meant that he had threatened someone in a way that caused fear. He was also convicted of criminal trespassing, which meant he had entered someone else's property without permission. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison for these crimes. However, he did not serve the full 6 years. He was incarcerated from October 1978 until August 1979. That means he spent less than a year in prison before he was released. This was the first time Ford had a criminal record, and it showed that he had a pattern of threatening behavior. After his release from prison, Ford tried to live a normal life. He had grown up attending church and had been a religious person in his youth. He was active in his church and believed in God. But during his early 20s, he strayed from that path. He started relying more on drugs and alcohol. He made poor choices and spent time with people who were not good influences. His life did not have a clear direction. At some point, Ford met a woman named Martha Chapman Matich. Martha worked at a grocery store called Chapman's Grocery in Newton County, Georgia. The store was owned by her family. Ford and Martha began a romantic relationship. They dated for about a year and a half. During this time, they lived together in a trailer. However, their relationship was not healthy. Ford became controlling and abusive toward Martha. He would not let her make her own decisions. He tried to control what she did and who she saw. At one point, he tied her up inside the trailer they shared. He burned her and tortured her. These were serious acts of violence. Martha was afraid of him. She had to ask the police for help. After that incident, she needed a police escort to take her home every night after she finished working at the store. This shows that Ford's behavior was dangerous and that the authorities were aware of the problem. Despite his abusive behavior, Martha tried to see the good in him. Her brother, who was a Baptist minister, met Ford once and told Martha that he thought Ford was evil. He advised her to end the relationship, but Martha believed that Ford could change. She thought that she could help him become a better person. She stayed with him longer than she should have. Eventually, Martha realized that Ford was not going to change. She ended the relationship. This happened only a few weeks before the events that would later take place. After the breakup, Ford did not leave Martha alone. He began to harass her by telephone. He called her repeatedly. He would not stop. He was angry that she had left him. Martha was frightened by his behavior. To protect herself, she moved out of the trailer they had shared and went to live with her sister-in-law, Cindy Chapman Griffith, and her family. She thought that staying with family would keep her safe from Ford. But Ford did not stop his harassment. He continued to call her. He told his friends that he was angry and wanted revenge. He said that Martha had hurt him and that he was going to make her pay. He talked about wanting to hurt her. His friends knew that he was serious because of his past behavior. They could see that he was filled with rage. Ford had no car, so he began asking his friends for rides. He told them that he wanted to go to the grocery store where Martha worked. He said he had a plan. He told one friend that he wanted to rob the store and kill Martha. He said he would take her into the woods, make her beg for her life, and then shoot her in the forehead. When his friends refused to help him, he became even more frustrated. One friend turned him down, and Ford responded by saying that there was nobody crazy enough to help him anymore. He was looking for someone who would do what he asked. He was determined to carry out his plan. He kept searching for a person who would drive him to the store. He did not give up. Ford continued his search for someone who would drive him to the store. He had asked several people, but they all refused to help him. Then he met a man named Roger Turner. Turner was 19 years old. He did not have a job, and he was almost out of money. Ford saw that Turner was desperate and easy to convince. He told Turner that they could rob the grocery store and get $8,000 easily. To make Turner agree, Ford gave him alcohol. The two men drank several alcoholic drinks together. Ford kept promising Turner that they would get a lot of money. Turner finally agreed to help. He agreed to drive Ford to the store in his car. On the night of March 6, 1986, Ford and Turner got into Turner's car. They drove to Chapman's Grocery in Newton County, Georgia. They arrived just after the store had closed for the night. The store was locked. The front door had a glass panel with metal bars across it. Ford did not try to pick the lock or find another way in. Instead, he took out a handgun. He shot at the lower half of the locked and barred glass door. The bullets broke the glass and the bars. This created a hole large enough for him to crawl through. He entered the store through this opening. Turner stayed behind in the car. He waited outside while Ford went inside. Turner later said that he heard screams coming from inside the store. Then he heard gunshots. He waited in the car while the sounds continued. After a short time, Ford came running back out of the store. He was carrying a bag of money. He got into the car, and the two men drove away. Inside the store at that time were two people. One was Martha Chapman Matich. She was 31 years old. She was the woman who had ended her relationship with Ford a few weeks earlier. She worked at the store as a clerk. The other person was Lisa Chapman. Lisa was 11 years old. She was Martha's niece. Lisa had come to the store that evening to spend time with her aunt. She had been playing with the minnows and crickets that the store sold as fishing bait. Another woman had been working with Martha that night, but that woman had gone home sick. So it was just Martha and Lisa in the store when Ford arrived. Ford had a gun with him. He shot Martha 3 times. She fell down behind the counter and died from her wounds. Lisa was terrified. She ran to the bathroom to hide. She crouched down by the toilet and tried to stay quiet. But Ford found her there. Lisa was staring at him and begging him not to hurt her. She pleaded with him to stop. Despite her pleas, Ford shot her in the head. She did not die immediately. She was still alive and had convulsions. But she could not speak or answer questions because of the severe injury to her head. At 10:20 p.m., the store's burglar alarm went off. This alarm was connected to the police department. A sheriff's deputy from Newton County was sent to the store to check on the alarm. The deputy arrived at 10:27 p.m., only 7 minutes after the alarm sounded. When he entered the store, he found Martha Matich lying dead on the floor behind the counter. She had been shot 3 times. Then he went to the bathroom. There he found Lisa Chapman sitting on a bucket. She was bleeding from her head and having convulsions. She could not speak or answer any questions. The deputy called for medical help. Lisa was taken to a hospital by helicopter, but she died before she could receive the care she needed. She was only 11 years old. Ford had taken money from the store. The amount he took was $579.80. He had carried this money out of the store in a bag and put it in Turner's car. The two men drove away from the scene after the shooting. The police who responded to the alarm noticed several things at the scene. They saw the broken glass door and the bullet holes. They found shell casings from the gun Ford had used. They also found the bodies of the two victims. The store had security cameras and other evidence that would later help the police understand what had happened. But at that moment, the police did not know who had committed the crime. They did not know that Ford was the shooter. They began their initial investigation by looking at the physical evidence and trying to find witnesses who had seen anything unusual near the store that night. After the deputy discovered the bodies and called for medical help, the police began their investigation immediately. They secured the crime scene and collected physical evidence. They found the broken glass door, the bullet casings, and the spent bullets. They also checked the store's burglar alarm records, which told them exactly when the alarm had gone off. The police knew that the crime had happened around 10:20 p.m. that night. They started asking people in the area if they had seen any suspicious activity. They looked for witnesses who might have seen a car or people near the store around that time. The investigation moved quickly because the police had good evidence and because one of the people involved was not careful. The police traced the gun used in the shooting. They also found out that Ford had been asking people for rides to the store and had been talking about his plan to rob the store and hurt Martha. Several people who knew Ford told the police what he had said. This gave the police a clear suspect. They also learned that Ford had been seen with Roger Turner on the night of the crime. Based on this information, the police identified both Ford and Turner as suspects. On the very next day after the crime, which was March 7, 1986, the police arrested both Ford and Turner. The two men were taken into custody and brought to the police station for questioning. The police advised both men of their legal rights, which are known as Miranda rights. This meant they were told they had the right to remain silent and the right to have an attorney present during questioning. Turner was the first to confess. He told the police everything that had happened. He admitted that he had driven Ford to the store and that he had waited in the car while Ford went inside. He said he had heard screams and gunshots. He admitted that Ford had come out with a bag of money and that they had driven away together. Turner's confession was recorded on video. After Turner confessed, the police brought him into the room where Ford was being held. Turner told Ford that he had told the truth about what happened. Ford responded by telling Turner not to worry. He said that Turner was not involved in the murders. This showed that Ford was trying to protect Turner or minimize his own guilt. After this, Ford spoke to the police. He gave his own version of events. He said that the shooting began after Martha pushed the alarm button. He said that if he had worn a mask, the crime would not have been discovered or the outcome would have been different. He did not admit to planning the murders in detail. He also later claimed at trial that he was too drunk to know what was happening and that it was Turner who had entered the store and killed the victims. However, his statements to the police did not match the physical evidence or Turner's confession. The police concluded that Ford was the shooter. The case went to trial in Newton County, Georgia. The trial began in October 1986. The prosecution presented evidence against Ford. They called witnesses who testified that Ford had threatened Martha and had told people he was going to rob the store and kill her. They presented Turner's testimony. Turner testified against Ford as part of a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for his truthful testimony, the prosecution agreed to drop the murder charges against Turner. Turner pleaded guilty to armed robbery and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was not given the death penalty because he cooperated with the state. Ford's defense team argued that he was too drunk to form the intent to commit the crimes. They also tried to blame Turner for the actual shooting. But the jury did not believe Ford's story. The evidence against him was strong. The jury deliberated for only an hour and a half before finding Ford guilty on all charges. He was convicted of 2 counts of malice murder, armed robbery, burglary, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The trial then moved to the sentencing phase. The jury had to decide whether Ford should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution presented the aggravating circumstances. They showed that Ford had committed the murders while also committing armed robbery and burglary. These were statutory aggravating factors under Georgia law. The defense presented mitigating evidence. They called a psychiatrist who testified about Ford's emotional problems, his difficult childhood, and his drug and alcohol abuse. They also called Ford's mother, who testified about his struggles and his family background. But the jury found that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating evidence. After deliberating for only 1 hour, the jury returned a sentence of death for each of the 2 murder convictions. On October 24, 1986, the judge formally sentenced Ford to death. He also received additional sentences of 20 years for armed robbery, 20 years for burglary, and 5 years for possession of a firearm. These sentences were to run consecutively, meaning one after another. After the trial, Ford began a long series of appeals. This process is standard in death penalty cases. His first appeal went to the Georgia Supreme Court. On September 24, 1987, the Georgia Supreme Court affirmed his convictions and death sentences. The court reviewed all the issues Ford raised, including his claims about the interrogation, the jury selection, and the evidence. The court found no errors. Ford then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, but on March 7, 1988, that court refused to hear his case. Ford did not give up. He filed a petition for habeas corpus in state court in June 1988. This is a legal process where a prisoner challenges the legality of his detention. The state habeas court held a hearing and denied his request in December 1996. He then asked the Georgia Supreme Court for permission to appeal, but that was denied in September 2000. The U.S. Supreme Court again refused to hear his case in June 2001. Ford filed another state habeas petition in September 2001, but the court dismissed it because he had already filed one before. In the same month, he filed a federal habeas petition in the United States District Court. He argued that the prosecution had not disclosed a deal with Turner and that his trial lawyers had been ineffective. The district court held an evidentiary hearing on these claims and denied him relief in May 2007. Ford appealed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. On October 27, 2008, the 11th Circuit affirmed the district court's decision. The court found that there was no secret deal with Turner and that Ford's lawyers had performed adequately at trial. The U.S. Supreme Court once again refused to hear the case on January 25, 2010. After all these appeals were exhausted, the state of Georgia set an execution date. Ford was originally scheduled to be executed on February 23, 2010. But that date was postponed because the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles had a vacant position. Under Georgia law, an execution cannot proceed without a full 5-member board. The board granted a stay of execution for 90 days until a 5th member was appointed. Governor Sonny Perdue appointed a new member, and the board reviewed Ford's request for clemency. They denied his request on June 4, 2010. The execution was rescheduled for June 9, 2010. On that day, Ford was taken to the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison near Jackson, Georgia. He was given a final meal. He requested fried fish, shrimp, a baked potato, salad, boiled corn, ice cream, cheesecake, and soda. He ate most of the meal. He declined a sedative and also declined an offer from the prison chaplain to pray with him. He was then taken to the death chamber. At 7:17 p.m., the 3-drug lethal injection cocktail began flowing into his veins. Within a minute, his eyes closed and his breathing became shallow. At 7:27 p.m., he was pronounced dead. His final words were a thank you to his family, friends, and loved ones. He did not apologize to the families of his victims. The families of Martha Matich and Lisa Chapman witnessed the execution. Lisa's mother, Cindy Griffith, said that the execution brought closure, but that she was disappointed Ford did not show remorse. She said that lethal injection was too easy for him. Martha's brother, Paul Chapman, said he had forgiven Ford because that is what God would want, but he wished Ford had admitted his guilt and asked for forgiveness. The execution closed a chapter that had haunted the victims' families for over 24 years. Roger Turner, who had driven Ford to the store and pleaded guilty to armed robbery, served his prison sentence. He was paroled in 1991, after serving only 5 years of his 20-year sentence. He was released and went back into the community. The victims' families continued to live with their loss. Lisa Chapman was remembered as a tender-hearted girl who loved animals, wanted to become a teacher, and had been saved at a Bible school just 1 week before her death. Martha Matich was remembered as a quiet, reserved woman who always looked for the good in others. The store where they died remained a painful memory for the family, but the execution of Ford allowed them to feel that justice had finally been served. Melbert Ray Ford was executed by the state of Georgia for the murders of Martha Chapman Matich and Lisa Chapman, and his death marked the end of a long legal process that had lasted nearly 24 years from the day of the crime to the day of his execution. Story 3. John Forrest Parker was born on May 21, 1968. He was born in the state of Alabama. His parents were Edward Parker and Joan Parker. They lived in the Florence area. Florence is a city in the northern part of the state. John was their son. They raised him in a normal home. His family provided for him. He grew up like most children in his area. When John was about 2 years old, something happened that changed his life. He suffered a head injury. The injury was serious. It caused him to be unconscious for about 2 days. His parents were very worried. They took him to doctors. The doctors helped him recover. But this injury had lasting effects on his health and behavior. As John grew older, his parents noticed he was very active. He had trouble sitting still. He could not focus on things for long. He also had physical reactions when he felt pressure. He would shake intensely. He would vomit when stressed. His mother, Joan, took him to a doctor for these problems. The doctor diagnosed him with hyperactivity. This was a condition that made it hard for him to pay attention and stay calm. The doctor prescribed a medication called Ritalin. This medicine was meant to help John sit still and listen. His mother gave him the medicine. It did help him calm down, but Joan was worried about side effects. The medicine interfered with his ability to sleep at night, so she did not always give him the full dose that the doctor ordered. She gave him less than what was prescribed. John took the Ritalin during his early school years. He went to kindergarten and first grade. The medicine helped him function in class. But around the time he was 10 to 12 years old, his mother stopped giving him the medicine. He was taken off Ritalin completely. Around that same time, John fell behind his classmates in school. He struggled with his lessons. He could not keep up with the other students. His mother wanted him to be placed in special education classes. She believed this would help him learn at his own speed. She asked the school to do this, but the school did not place him in those classes. So John continued in regular classes. He did not do well. He became frustrated and discouraged. During this time, John started spending time with older boys. These boys were not a good influence on him. They introduced him to drugs and alcohol. He began using marijuana. He also started drinking alcohol. This happened when he was still young, around the age of 10 to 12. His parents became very worried about his behavior. About 6 weeks after he stopped taking Ritalin, John began having severe physical reactions. His body showed signs of withdrawal or distress. His parents noticed these changes. They realized he was heading down a bad path. They decided to get him help. When John was in middle school, his parents placed him in a drug treatment program. This program lasted for 6 weeks. It was meant to help him stop using drugs and alcohol. The program seemed to work for a short time, but after about 4 months, John went back to his old habits. He started using drugs and alcohol again. He could not stay away from them. His addiction was becoming stronger. When John was 18 years old, he entered another drug treatment program. He tried again to get clean, but his efforts did not last. His drug use continued. By the time he was 19, his drug use had become more serious. He started using drugs intravenously. This meant he was injecting drugs directly into his veins. He was using a drug called Talwin. This was a strong painkiller. It was a narcotic. He was also using other drugs. John's mother later described his behavior. She said that he was never violent toward other people. She said the only violent acts she saw were directed at himself or at objects. He would break things when he was upset, but he did not hurt other people. He was not aggressive or cruel to others. John had a girlfriend at this time. Her name was Angela Fountain. They spent time together. He also had friends. One of his friends was Kenneth Eugene Smith. Another person he knew was Billy Gray Williams. These were people in his social circle. They were part of his life in Florence. At school, John had a teacher named Charlotte Dean. She taught him in the 8th grade. She later described him as a quiet and easygoing student. She said he was not a discipline problem. He accepted authority. He did not cause trouble in class. But she also noticed he seemed sad and melancholy most of the time. He looked unhappy. He did not seem to mature emotionally, intellectually, or socially after the 7th grade. He remained stuck at that level. John also had trouble with his schoolwork. Tests later showed that his intelligence was below average. His reading and math skills were at a 7th grade level. He was better at working with his hands than with words. He had difficulty making good decisions. He had trouble retaining information for a long time. He also had trouble controlling his impulses. John never finished his education in a strong way. He struggled through school. He did not have a successful academic career. He did not go to college. He did not have a professional job. Instead, he spent time with people who were involved in drugs and minor crimes. John's life was marked by these struggles. He had a head injury as a toddler. He had hyperactivity. He was medicated, but then taken off the medication. He fell behind in school. He started using drugs and alcohol at a young age. He went to treatment programs but relapsed each time. By age 19, he was injecting drugs and living a life centered around his addiction. He had friends who shared similar habits. He had no steady career or clear path forward. He was simply living day to day in Florence, Alabama, with his girlfriend and his associates. The story now moves to March 1988. John Forrest Parker was 19 years old. He was living in Florence, Alabama. He was still using drugs. He was still spending time with his friends Kenneth Eugene Smith and Billy Gray Williams. At that time, a man named Charles Sennett entered the picture. Charles Sennett was a minister. He led a church called Westside Church of Christ in Sheffield, Alabama. He was married to a woman named Elizabeth Dorling Sennett. She was 45 years old. She was a grandmother. Charles Sennett had serious problems. He was in deep financial trouble. He owed a lot of money. He also wanted to end his marriage to his wife. He had a girlfriend on the side. He wanted to be free from his wife, but he did not want a divorce. Instead, he came up with a different plan. He decided to have his wife killed. He wanted to collect money from her life insurance policy. He had recently taken out an insurance policy on her life. Charles Sennett knew Billy Gray Williams. Williams was one of his tenants. That meant Williams rented property from Sennett. Sennett approached Williams with an offer. He offered to pay Williams $3,000 to murder his wife. Williams agreed to do it, but Williams did not want to do the killing himself. So he found other people to do the actual work. Williams then contacted John Forrest Parker and Kenneth Eugene Smith. He offered each of them $1,000 to commit the murder. Both men agreed to do it. The plan was set in motion. The killing was arranged as a contract for money. The day before the murder, which was March 17th, 1988, Williams gave Parker $100. This money was meant to buy a weapon. Parker was supposed to purchase a gun for the job. But Parker did not buy a weapon. Instead, he took the $100 and used it to buy drugs. He was addicted to drugs. He could not resist the temptation. So he spent the money on his addiction. On the morning of March 18th, 1988, Parker and Smith got ready to carry out the murder. Parker had a survival knife. This was a large knife with a blade. He brought this knife with him. Smith sat in the passenger seat of Parker's car. As they drove to the victim's home, Smith sharpened the knife. He made it very sharp. They drove to the house of Elizabeth Dorling Sennett. The house was located on a road called Coon Dog Cemetery Road in Colbert County, Alabama. This was a rural area. Parker parked his car behind the Sennett home. They did not park in front where they could be easily seen. They parked in the back. Then they went to the front door. Parker told Dorling that her husband had given them permission to look at the property. He said they wanted to use the land as a hunting site. Dorling believed them. She gave them permission to walk around the property. So Parker and Smith walked into a wooded area near the house. They stayed there for a little while. After some time, they returned to the house. They asked Dorling if they could use her bathroom. She agreed. She let them inside her home. They went into the bathroom. While they were inside the bathroom, Parker took some cotton socks. He put these socks onto his hands. He put them over his fingers and palms. This was a deliberate action. He did not want to leave fingerprints. He wanted to protect himself from being identified. After Parker put the socks on his hands, he came out of the bathroom. Smith came out with him. Parker then jumped on Dorling. He began hitting her. He attacked her suddenly. She was not expecting this. She tried to defend herself, but she could not fight them off. Both Parker and Smith attacked her. They used a galvanized pipe. A galvanized pipe is a metal tube. They hit her with this pipe. They also stabbed her with the survival knife. Dorling was terrified. She pleaded with them. She begged them not to hurt her. She asked them to stop, but they did not stop. They continued to hit her and stab her. They held her down with a small blue chair. They used the chair to pin her to the ground. While she was held down, they stabbed her repeatedly. She suffered many wounds. The stabs went into her chest, her neck, her forehead, her nose, and her scalp. She also had bruises on her face. The injuries were very severe. After they finished the attack, Parker and Smith followed a plan. They wanted to make it look like a robbery. They wanted the police to think a burglar had broken in. So they broke the glass in the medicine cabinet. They made it look like someone had searched the bathroom. They also took a stereo and a video cassette recorder, which is called a VCR. They stole these items from the house. They intended to make the scene look like a burglary that went wrong. Then Parker and Smith left the house. They drove away. They did not try to help Dorling. They left her badly injured and bleeding. They knew she was dying. They did not call for help. They just left. After they left, Parker took further steps to hide what he had done. He burned his clothes. He wanted to destroy any evidence. He also threw the stolen stereo off a bridge. He got rid of it. He and Smith threw away the survival knife that they had used. They disposed of the murder weapon. They did not want anyone to find it. Later, Parker went back to Billy Gray Williams. He collected the rest of his payment. Williams gave him the additional $900. So Parker received the full $1,000 for the murder. Back at the Sennett home, something else happened. Charles Sennett, the husband, arrived home later. He found his house ransacked. He found his wife close to death. She was still alive, but barely. He called for help. He called the Colbert County Sheriff's investigator, whose name was Ronnie May. He made this call at 11:44 in the morning. The sheriff's office dispatched a rescue squad and deputies to the home. The deputies and the rescue squad arrived at the Sennett home at about 12:05 in the afternoon. They found Dorleen severely injured. She was still alive at that moment. The rescue squad took her to the hospital. A doctor named David Parks McKinley tried to save her. He attempted resuscitation. He tried to bring her back, but his efforts failed. Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett was declared dead. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest and exsanguination. Exsanguination means she bled to death. She had lost too much blood from her stab wounds. The husband, Charles Sennett, remained a suspect. A week after his wife's murder, he committed suicide. He killed himself with a gun. He shot himself in his son's backyard. He took his own life before he could be arrested or questioned further about the crime. This happened on March 25, 1988, exactly 7 days after his wife was killed. He left behind questions that he never answered. At the crime scene, investigators found some evidence. They found a cap near Dorleen's body. They found hairs on this cap. These hairs were later found to match Kenneth Eugene Smith. They also found an Afghan, which is a type of blanket, wrapped around Dorleen's body. On this Afghan, they found fibers. These fibers later matched fibers taken from Parker's survival knife. They also found the VCR that was stolen from the Sennett house. It was later discovered inside Smith's residence. These physical clues connected the two men to the scene, but the police did not arrest Parker immediately. At the time, they were still gathering information. They had not yet made any arrests. The investigation was just beginning. The evidence was being collected and examined. The police were working to understand exactly who was involved and how the crime was carried out. For now, the killers had left the scene and were still free. Parker had his money. He had tried to cover his tracks, but the physical evidence left behind at the house would later tell a different story. After the murder of Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett, the police continued their investigation. They had physical evidence from the crime scene. They had found hairs that matched Kenneth Eugene Smith. They had found fibers on the Afghan that matched Parker's knife. They had also found the stolen VCR inside Smith's residence. These items were important clues. They pointed the police toward the two men who had committed the attack. On March 28, 1988, 10 days after the murder, the police received new information. A confidential informant came forward. This person provided details about the crime. The informant named 3 individuals who were involved. The names given were John Forrest Parker, Kenneth Eugene Smith, and Billy Gray Williams. The informant also described the stolen VCR and said where it could be found. The police verified some of this information. They confirmed the addresses and vehicles of the named individuals. They also confirmed that the VCR was located where the informant said it would be. Based on this information, the police decided to act. On March 31, 1988, law enforcement officers went to Parker's residence. They went to an apartment on Huntsville Road in Florence. They approached the home. They knocked on the door and asked Parker to come out. Parker was taken into custody. He was transported to the Colbert County Sheriff's Office. There, he was given his legal warnings, known as Miranda rights. He was told he could remain silent, and that he had the right to a lawyer. After receiving these warnings, Parker made a statement. He admitted his involvement in the murder. He described his role in the crime. This confession was an important piece of evidence for the prosecution. On April 7, 1988, Parker was indicted by a grand jury. He was charged with capital murder. The specific charge was murder for pecuniary gain. This meant murder committed for money. The indictment stated that he had killed Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett by beating and stabbing her for a payment of $1,000. The charge carried the possibility of the death penalty. The trial began in June 1989. The prosecution presented its case against Parker. They called witnesses. They presented the physical evidence. They introduced Parker's confession. The defense argued that Parker was guilty of assault and burglary, but not murder. They tried to suggest that Charles Sennett may have killed his wife after Parker and Smith left, but the evidence was strong. On June 6, 1989, the jury found John Forrest Parker guilty of capital murder. The verdict was unanimous. The jurors all agreed that he was guilty of the charge. After the guilty verdict, the same jury heard evidence during a sentencing phase. The jury had to decide whether Parker should receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury deliberated on this question. They voted on the punishment. The vote was 10-2 in favor of life imprisonment without parole. 10 jurors believed he should spend the rest of his life in prison. 2 jurors believed he should receive the death penalty. The jury's formal recommendation was life without parole. Under Alabama law at that time, the jury's recommendation was not binding. The trial judge had the authority to override the jury's decision. The judge in this case was Inga Johnson. She considered the evidence and the law. She weighed the aggravating circumstances against the mitigating circumstances. She found one aggravating circumstance: the murder was committed for money. She found mitigating circumstances: Parker had no significant prior criminal record. He was 19 years old at the time of the crime. He showed remorse, and the jury had recommended life without parole. After weighing these factors, Judge Johnson concluded that the aggravating circumstance outweighed the mitigating ones. On June 21, 1989, she sentenced John Forrest Parker to death. The sentence was originally death by electrocution. Parker was sent to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, to await execution. Parker appealed his conviction and sentence. He filed direct appeals to higher courts. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed his conviction and sentence in 1992. The Alabama Supreme Court also affirmed it. The United States Supreme Court declined to review his case in 1993. He then filed for post-conviction relief under state law. This was denied. He filed a federal habeas corpus petition in 2000. The federal district court denied his petition. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that denial in 2009. All his legal challenges were exhausted. No court found a reason to overturn his conviction or sentence. During this same period, the other participants in the crime were also brought to justice. Billy Gray Williams, who had arranged the murder, was tried and convicted of capital murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was not given the death penalty. Kenneth Eugene Smith was also tried and convicted of capital murder for his role in the killing. He was sentenced to death. At the time of Parker's execution, Smith was still alive and awaiting his own execution date. The victim's husband, Charles Sennett, had already taken his own life 1 week after the murder. He was never tried for the crime. As the years passed, Parker remained on death row. He spent more than 2 decades in prison. During that time, his execution date was set. The date was scheduled for June 10, 2010. Leading up to that day, Parker's attorneys made a final effort to stop the execution. They appealed to the United States Supreme Court for a stay. They argued that the judge's override of the jury's recommendation was unconstitutional. The Alabama Attorney General's office opposed this request. The Alabama Supreme Court voted 7-2 to reject his plea for a stay. On the day of the execution, the U.S. Supreme Court also rejected his final appeal. No stay was granted. On June 10, 2010, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, the execution proceeded. Parker was given a final meal. He chose fried fish, French fries, and iced tea. He spent much of that day meeting with friends and family members. His mother, Joan Parker, and his father, Edward Parker, visited him. 2 religious advisors were also present to offer support. Before the execution began, Parker spoke his final words. He addressed the family of Elizabeth Dorling Sennett. He said, "I'm sorry. I don't ever expect you to forgive me. I really am sorry." These were his only words. The execution team, then proceeded with the lethal injection. The drugs were administered. At 6:41 p.m., John Forrest Parker was pronounced dead. After the execution, the victim's sons, Charles Sennett and Michael Sennett, spoke to the media. They said the execution was a step toward justice. They also expressed sympathy for Parker's family. They acknowledged that both families had suffered. Colbert County Sheriff Ronnie May, who had been the lead investigator in the case, said he hoped the execution would bring closure to the victim's family. He noted that Kenneth Eugene Smith was still awaiting his own execution date. Parker's death did not end the legal proceedings for the other convicted killer. The family of Elizabeth Dorling Sennett had waited 22 years for this moment. They had lost their mother in a brutal way. They had also lost their father to suicide shortly after the murder. They never received full answers from him. The execution of John Forrest Parker marked the end of one part of their long ordeal. But the pain of losing their mother remained. The case was finally closed for Parker, but the memory of the crime and its impact would last forever. Story 4. David Lee Powell was born on January 13, 1951. He grew up on an 80-acre dairy farm near Campbell, Texas. Campbell was a very small town with fewer than 500 people. It was located about 60 miles northeast of Dallas. David's parents were Marjorie and Bill Powell. They were farmers who worked hard to take care of their land and their animals. From a young age, David helped his family with the farm work. He learned to wake up early and do chores like milking cows and feeding the livestock. Life on the farm was simple and quiet. David was a very bright child. He did extremely well in school from the very beginning. His teachers noticed that he was smarter than most of the other students. He was curious about many subjects and loved to learn new things. His classmates thought he was a genius. He was described as the class nerd. He wore thick glasses and always had a smile on his face. He was also shy and somewhat naive. He did not cause trouble and was well liked by his teachers and peers. David worked hard in his studies and his grades were always excellent. David's academic success continued through high school. He was so advanced that he skipped his junior year of high school. This meant he graduated a year earlier than most students. When he graduated, he was the valedictorian of his class. That meant he had the highest grades of all the students in his small graduating class. There were only 15 students in his class. He was also voted most likely to succeed by his teachers and classmates. Everyone expected him to do great things in life. His future seemed very bright and full of promise. After high school, David was accepted into the Plan 2 honors program at the University of Texas in Austin. This was a very selective program for the best students. The university officials were excited to have him. His SAT scores were almost perfect. He started college in the fall of 1968. At first, he had some trouble adjusting to college life, but his grades and schoolwork soon improved. He was majoring in physics and mathematics. He had dreams of becoming a doctor one day. His family was very proud of him. They believed he would have a successful career. However, during his sophomore year, things began to change. David became involved in the anti-war movement. Many students at the time were protesting the Vietnam War. David joined these protests and became politically active. Around the same time, he began experimenting with drugs. This was a turning point in his life. The drugs started to take over his life. He began using more and more. His focus on school started to slip. He stopped caring about his classes and his future. In 1970, David dropped out of the University of Texas. He never finished college. This was the first major sign that something was wrong. After leaving college, David's life went downhill quickly. He became a heavy user of methamphetamine. He also started selling the drug to make money. Over the next 8 years, his addiction grew worse. His personality changed completely. The calm, responsible boy from the farm was gone. He became a different person. He was flighty and talked very fast. His appearance changed too. He became thin, disoriented, and disheveled. He no longer looked like the neat and tidy student he had once been. David's family became very worried about him. They noticed the drastic change in his behavior. His uncle, Clem Struve, said David once called him and said he had to be careful talking because the CIA was after him. This showed that David was becoming paranoid. His mother, Marjorie, thought he was having a nervous breakdown. She called a psychiatrist and tried to find help for him. But David disappeared. No matter how hard his family searched, they could not find him. He had cut off contact with them. By 1978, David's life had fallen apart. He was a heavy drug user and dealer. He had no stable job. He had been evicted from an apartment for not paying rent. He had an arrest record for auto theft, petty theft, and drug possession. He was wanted by the police for passing over 100 bad checks to merchants in the Austin area. He had also become very paranoid. Because of his paranoia, he began carrying around loaded weapons. He carried a .45 caliber pistol and an AK-47 rifle. He also carried a hand grenade. He felt like he needed these weapons to protect himself. He was living a dangerous and unstable life. The promising young man from the farm had become someone his family no longer recognized. On the evening of May 17, 1978, David Lee Powell asked his former girlfriend, Sheila Meinert, to drive him from Austin to Killeen, Texas. They went in Powell's car, which was a red Ford Mustang. At that time, the Mustang did not have a rear license plate. Powell brought his AK-47 rifle, his .45 caliber pistol, and a hand grenade with him in the car. He also had a backpack that contained about 2¼ ounces of high-grade methamphetamine. The street value of this methamphetamine was approximately $5,000. That same evening, Austin Police Officer Ralph Ablanito was on duty in his marked patrol car. Officer Ablanito was 26 years old. He had been a police officer for 5 years. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Judy, and they had 2 young sons. One son was 5 years old, and the other was only 18 months old. Officer Ablanito loved fishing and was known as a good, decent human being who cared about his family and his job. At around 12:41 a.m. on May 18, 1978, Officer Ablanito spotted the red Mustang on the road. He noticed that the car did not have a rear license tag, which was a traffic violation. He pulled the vehicle over in the 900 block of Live Oak Street in South Austin. Officer Ablanito turned on his flashing lights and stopped behind the Mustang. Sheila Meinert, who was driving, got out of the car and walked toward the officer. She told him that she had lost her driver's license, but she showed him her passport as identification. Officer Ablanito also looked at Powell's driver's license. He then used his police radio to contact the dispatcher, Polly Biddick. He asked her to check both Meinert and Powell for any outstanding arrest warrants. He also asked her to check if the Mustang had been reported stolen. The dispatcher informed Officer Ablanito that the computer system was not working properly at that time. However, she was able to check local records and found that there were no local warrants for Sheila Meinert. Officer Ablanito then issued Meinert a citation for failing to display a driver's license and for the missing license plate. He allowed her to drive away. As the Mustang started to pull away from the curb, the dispatcher received new information. The computer system came back online. She discovered that there was a possible warrant for David Lee Powell for misdemeanor theft. She immediately radioed Officer Ablanito with this information. The dispatcher also called Officer Bruce Mills, who was Officer Ablanito's patrol partner, to go to the scene and provide backup. This was normal procedure when a person had a possible warrant. Officer Ablanito heard the dispatcher's message. He signaled for the Mustang to pull over again. Sheila Meinert stopped the car. Officer Ablanito got out of his patrol car and started walking toward the Mustang. At the same time, Minert got out of the driver's side and began walking toward the officer. As Officer Ablanito approached the car, David Lee Powell was sitting in the front passenger seat. He positioned himself in the middle of the front seat and leaned into the back seat. He raised his AK-47 rifle and aimed it through the rear window of the Mustang. Powell pulled the trigger and fired at Officer Ablanito through the back window. The weapon was initially set to semi-automatic mode. This meant Powell had to pull the trigger each time he wanted to fire a single shot. The first shots hit Officer Ablanito and knocked him to the ground. The officer tried to get up from the pavement. As he attempted to stand, Powell switched the AK-47 to full automatic mode. In full automatic mode, the gun fired multiple bullets continuously while Powell held down the trigger. Powell fired at Officer Ablanito again. The bullets struck the officer multiple times. One of the shots also flattened one of the rear tires of the Mustang. After firing the shots, Powell stopped shooting. The Mustang drove away from the scene quickly. Officer Ablanito was lying on the ground with 10 gunshot wounds. He was wearing a bulletproof vest at the time, but the vest was not designed to stop bullets fired from a powerful automatic weapon like an AK-47. The bullets went through the vest. Officer Ablanito was in severe pain, but he was still conscious. He reached for his police radio and managed to call for help. He described what had happened. Bobby Bullard, a man who was driving home from work, witnessed the shooting. He saw shots being fired from the Mustang. He saw that the back windshield of the Mustang was blown out by the gunfire. He saw a man sitting in the middle of the front seat, leaning into the back seat, firing the weapon. Bullard identified the shooter as a man with long hair wearing a white t-shirt. He later identified that man as David Powell. Edward Segura, a man who lived in the area, heard what sounded like machine gun fire. He went outside and saw the red Mustang driving away. He went to help Officer Ablanito. When he asked the officer who had shot him, Officer Ablanito replied, "A girl." Other witnesses who came to help also heard Officer Ablanito say repeatedly, "That damn girl," or "that goddamn girl." Officer Bruce Mills arrived at the scene a few minutes later. He found his partner, Officer Ablanito, bleeding on the ground. Officer Ablanito told Mills that a girl and a guy were in the car. He said they were armed with a shotgun or a machine gun. He told Mills twice, "He got me with the shotgun." Officer Ablanito asked how badly he was hurt. Mills ran his hand over Ablanito's stomach and felt blood. He tried to reassure him by saying, "You'll be all right." Paramedics arrived and took Officer Ablanito to Brackenridge Hospital. The doctors worked to save his life, but his injuries were too severe. He died on the operating table about an hour after he was shot. Meanwhile, Sheila Minert drove the Mustang away from the shooting scene. She pulled into the parking lot of an apartment complex nearby. The car had a flat tire from the gunfire. Officer Joe Villegas was on his way to the original scene when he heard a description of the red Mustang over the police radio. He guessed that the car might be hiding in the apartment complex parking lot. He drove into the lot and saw the red Mustang with 2 occupants inside. As soon as he pulled in, he came under automatic weapon fire from the Mustang. The shots were coming from the right rear of the car. Officer Villegas stopped his patrol car, jumped out, and returned fire. He saw a man running in a crouched position away from the Mustang toward Travis High School, which was across the street. The man turned and looked back at Villegas from about 15 to 20 yards away. Villegas identified that man as David Powell. More police officers arrived at the apartment complex. A shootout continued between Powell and the officers. No one was hit during this exchange of gunfire. Sheila Minert testified later that Powell handed her the hand grenade. He told her to remove the tape from it. She started peeling the tape off, but she became hysterical. She shoved the grenade back at him and did not know what he did with it. Officer Bruce Boardman arrived at the apartment complex during the shooting. He saw a person with long hair, make a throwing motion toward the police officers. After that, Powell began running away from the scene toward the high school. Sheila Meinert was found lying down next to the Mustang and was taken into custody. After the shootout stopped, police officers searched the area around the Mustang. They found a live hand grenade on the ground about 10 feet away from Officer Villegas's patrol car. The safety pin of the grenade had been pulled out. However, the grenade did not explode. The safety clip, also known as a jungle clip, had not been removed. This safety clip was designed to keep the grenade from exploding accidentally, even if the pin was pulled. The police noted that only someone with military training would likely know about this safety clip. David Powell had never served in the military, but he had studied military manuals. The pin from the grenade was found on the ground near the passenger side of the Mustang. David Powell ran from the apartment complex toward Travis High School. He hid himself in some bushes on the school grounds. He had his .45 caliber pistol with him. He also had his backpack, which contained the methamphetamine. The police searched the area and tracked him down. They found Powell hiding in the bushes in the early morning hours of May 18th. They also found his pistol hidden under some shrubs and his backpack hanging in a tree. After the shooting, police officers searched the red Mustang. Inside the car, they found the AK-47 rifle, which was still hot from being fired recently. They found a shoulder holster, a gun case, and handcuffs. They also found a book called The Book of Rifles. Pages discussing the Soviet AK-47 rifle were marked with tabs. The book contained loose notes in Powell's handwriting about different types and models of weapons. The notes also referred to other books on weapons. In addition, police found books and notes about guerrilla warfare. Police then searched Powell's residence. Inside his home, they found another hand grenade. They found more weapons and ammunition. They discovered more books and manuals on weaponry and combat. They also found a methamphetamine lab with chemicals and laboratory equipment. They found 3 small vials of methamphetamine with a total weight of about 1 gram. Everything they found showed that Powell was deeply involved in weapons, explosives, and drug manufacturing. After David Powell was found hiding in the bushes at Travis High School in the early morning hours of May 18, 1978, he was taken into custody without any resistance. The police had already gathered a large amount of physical evidence from the Mustang, the apartment complex parking lot, and Powell's residence. This evidence linked him directly to the shooting of Officer Ralph Ablanito. The case against Powell was very strong from the beginning because witnesses had identified him, the murder weapon was found, and Powell himself was caught near the scene. On the same day as his arrest, the state of Texas filed a motion requesting a psychiatric examination of Powell. The trial court ordered this examination to determine if Powell was competent to stand trial and if he had been sane at the time of the offense. Dr. Richard Coons, a psychiatrist, and Dr. George Parker, a psychologist, were appointed to conduct the evaluation. They examined Powell on multiple occasions in May, June, and July of 1978. Both doctors concluded that Powell was sane and competent to stand trial. In September 1978, Powell's first trial began in Travis County. The jury heard all the evidence from the prosecution and the defense. The defense raised the argument that Powell was insane at the time of the killing. They called their own psychiatrist, Dr. Emmanuel Tenney, who testified that Powell was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia caused by his long-term drug use. The prosecution countered with Dr. Coons and Dr. Parker, who testified that Powell was sane. The jury did not accept the insanity defense. On September 28, 1978, the jury convicted Powell of capital murder for killing a police officer. During the punishment phase, the same jury had to decide if Powell posed a future danger to society. The prosecutors called Dr. Coons and Dr. Parker again. Both doctors testified that there was a high probability Powell would commit future acts of violence. The jury agreed and sentenced Powell to death. After his conviction, Powell began a long series of appeals. His first direct appeal went to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. On July 8, 1987, that court affirmed his conviction and death sentence. Powell then took his case to the United States Supreme Court. In 1988, the Supreme Court vacated the Texas court's judgment and sent the case back for reconsideration. The Supreme Court had recently decided a case called Satterwhite v. Texas, which dealt with the same issue of psychiatric testimony used without proper warnings. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed Powell's case again. On January 11, 1989, they once again affirmed his conviction and death sentence. They ruled that Powell had waived his right to object to the psychiatric testimony because he had presented his own psychiatric evidence at trial. Powell appealed again to the United States Supreme Court. On July 3, 1989, the Supreme Court reversed Powell's conviction. The court found that his Sixth Amendment right to counsel had been violated. The psychiatrists had examined Powell without notifying his lawyers that the examination would also cover the issue of future dangerousness. Powell's defense team had not been given a chance to advise him about this. Because of this constitutional violation, the death sentence could not stand. The Supreme Court sent the case back to Texas for a new trial. Because Texas law at that time required a completely new trial when a sentence was reversed, Powell was tried for a second time in November 1991. The jury again convicted him of capital murder and sentenced him to death. Powell appealed this second conviction and sentence. On December 7, 1994, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals made a decision. They affirmed Powell's conviction, but they vacated his death sentence. The court ruled that the trial judge had given an incorrect instruction to the jury on one of the special issues they had to consider. The case was sent back for a new punishment hearing. By this time, Texas law had changed. When a death sentence was thrown out, the guilty verdict could remain in place. The state only had to hold a new punishment trial, not a complete new trial on guilt or innocence. Powell's third punishment trial began in February 1999. The defense team's strategy was to argue that Powell was no longer a future danger to society. They presented evidence that after more than 20 years in prison, Powell had become a model inmate. Several prison guards testified that he was quiet, well-mannered, and respectful. He had helped other inmates learn to read. He worked in the prison garment factory and was a good worker. Friends and family members testified that after he stopped using drugs, he returned to the kind, intelligent person he had been before his addiction. However, the prosecutors argued that the brutal facts of the murder itself showed Powell was still dangerous. They also presented evidence of minor disciplinary infractions in prison, such as having extra socks or playing his radio too loud. The jury had to decide whether Powell still posed a continuing threat. On March 6, 1999, after deliberating, the jury again answered yes to the future dangerousness question and sentenced Powell to death for the third time. Powell continued to appeal this third sentence. His conviction and death sentence were affirmed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals on January 16, 2002. The United States Supreme Court denied his request for review on November 4, 2002. Powell then filed a state habeas corpus petition, which was denied by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals on September 25, 2002. He filed a federal habeas corpus petition in 2003. The U.S. District Court denied his petition on December 27, 2005. He appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. On July 16, 2008, that court granted him a certificate of appealability, but ultimately affirmed the denial of habeas relief. Powell then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court again, but his petition was denied on March 23, 2009. A second state habeas application was dismissed on September 30, 2009. After 32 years of legal proceedings, all of Powell's appeals were exhausted. On June 15, 2010, David Lee Powell was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 59 years old. He had spent more than 32 years on death row, which made him the longest-serving inmate ever executed in Texas since the state resumed executions in 1982. Powell chose not to make a final statement. The execution began at 6:10 p.m. He was pronounced dead 9 minutes later, at 6:19 p.m. His final meal consisted of 4 eggs, for chicken drumsticks, salsa, for jalapeno peppers, lettuce, tortillas, hash browns, garlic bread, 2 pork chops, white and yellow grated cheese, sliced onions and tomatoes, a pitcher of milk, and a vanilla shake. The impact of the case continued long after the crime. Officer Bruce Mills, who had been Ablanito's partner and who had tried to save him, eventually married Ablanito's widow, Judy. Mills adopted her 2 sons, David and Steve. They raised the boys together. Ralph Ablanito's mother, Betsy, was 87 years old at the time of Powell's execution. She attended the execution along with other family members. Sheila Meinert, who had been Powell's driver that night, was convicted of attempted capital murder for her role in the apartment complex shootout. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was paroled in June 1989. She was discharged from her sentence in January 2000 with no further arrests. On the night of the execution, more than 150 active and retired Austin police officers traveled to Huntsville to show their support for Officer Ablanito's family. The officers stood as an honor guard outside the prison. The family members watched through the window as Powell was put to death. Bruce Mills said after the execution that the long legal process had finally ended and that relief was the main feeling. He described it as a weight being lifted from the family. The death of David Lee Powell closed the final chapter of a case that had lasted more than 3 decades, but the loss of Officer Ralph Ablanito remained a permanent sorrow for his family and the community. Story 5. Ronnie Lee Gardner was born on January 16, 1961, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He came into a family that was already struggling in many ways. His mother had 9 children to care for, and she had difficulty managing them all. The family did not have enough money, and they lived in poor conditions. At one point, they lived in a house that had been condemned by officials because it was not safe, but they stayed there because they had nowhere else to go. Gardner's father was not a steady presence in his life. His parents separated, and his mother later had a relationship with a stepfather who was involved in criminal activities. This exposed young Ronnie to a world of lawbreaking from an early age. The household was unstable, and there was little supervision or guidance for the children. When Ronnie was about 4 years old, he contracted meningitis. This is a serious illness that can affect the brain. Being sick with meningitis at such a young age was a major event in his life. Medical experts would later suggest that this illness might have caused some damage to his brain, which could have affected his behavior and judgment as he grew older. By the time he was 5 years old, Ronnie was already using drugs. He started sniffing gasoline and glue at this young age. This was a dangerous habit that could also cause brain damage. He continued using these substances for many years. By the time he was 10 years old, he was introduced to LSD, a powerful drug. His drug use started very early and continued throughout his childhood. When Ronnie was 8 years old, he was placed in the Utah State Hospital. This was a facility for children with behavioral problems. He spent time there because he was difficult to control and was getting into trouble. He stayed in this facility for about a year. While he was there, he was introduced to more drugs, including marijuana and acid. This was not a place that helped him improve. Instead, it exposed him to more bad influences. Gardner's early life was marked by constant moving between different homes and facilities. He was in and out of foster care. He spent time at the Utah State Hospital, and later, when he was around 14, he was placed in a state industrial school, which was a facility for troubled youth. He never had a stable home environment where he could learn proper behavior or develop good habits. The problems in his family were not limited to just him. His relatives also had a history of criminal behavior. His grandfather, brother, sister, nephew, 3 cousins, and 2 half-siblings all had been involved with the juvenile court system or had spent time in prison. This meant that crime was a normal part of life in his family. He grew up seeing this behavior all around him. As a child, Ronnie began committing minor offenses. By the age of 10, he had already been charged with public intoxication, shoplifting, petty larceny, grand larceny, and sniffing gas. He also showed violence toward fellow students and toward his sister. His behavior was getting worse as he got older. When Ronnie was 11 years old, psychological tests were performed on him at the Utah State Hospital. These tests showed evidence of possible brain impairment. His overall IQ was tested at 88, which falls in the dull normal range. However, he scored very high on some parts of the test and very low on others. This uneven pattern suggested that there might be some organic damage to his brain. The evaluator noted that his practical reasoning was average, but his ability to deal with written symbols was poor, which made it hard for him to learn in school. Gardner did not have a normal childhood. He was institutionalized for most of his young life. From age 8 onward, he was in and out of facilities. This meant he never learned normal social skills or how to get along with others in a healthy way. Instead, he absorbed the values of other troubled youths and criminals he was housed with. When he was still a teenager, Gardner committed a robbery. This was his first major crime as an adult. In February 1980, he was convicted of robbery and was sent to the Utah State Prison for the first time. He arrived at the prison on February 25, 1980. He was 19 years old. By this point, Gardner had a criminal record that included several offenses. But prison did not stop his behavior. On April 19, 1981, he escaped from the minimum security unit at the Utah State Prison along with another inmate. This was his first escape from prison. He was on the loose for about 2 weeks. During this time on the run, Gardner went to confront a man who was sleeping with his girlfriend. He was angry and wanted to confront this man. On April 30, 1981, he found the man. During this confrontation, Gardner was shot in the neck. He was wounded but survived. Police were called and they arrested him. He was taken to the hospital for his wound and then returned to prison. This was the first time Gardner had been shot, and it would not be the last. After this escape, Gardner was returned to prison to continue serving his sentence. He was known as a difficult inmate who was violent and impulsive. His behavior behind bars was often aggressive. He had a reputation for being a nasty little bugger with a mean streak, as he would later describe himself. Gardner had 2 children during this time. His daughter was born on May 23, 1977, and his son was born on February 9, 1980. Both children were born while he was in and out of prison or before his major incarceration. He was not present in their lives as a father figure because he was either in prison or on the run. He had little opportunity to build stable relationships with his children or with anyone else. Throughout his early life, Gardner showed patterns of behavior that were concerning. He could not hold down a job because he was in prison. He had no real education because he was in institutions. His social life was tied to criminal activity and drug use. He had a girlfriend, but his way of handling problems with her involved violence and confrontation, as seen when he confronted the man sleeping with her. By the time he was in his early 20s, Gardner had a history of institutionalization, drug abuse, violence, and criminal behavior. He had escaped from prison once and was caught again. He was serving time for robbery, but he was not a model prisoner. He continued to be a problem for the prison staff. He spent time in maximum security at the Utah State Prison. This was the most secure part of the facility, reserved for the most dangerous inmates. Gardner was placed there because of his violent history and his escape attempt. His life up to this point had been marked by neglect, abuse, poverty, and a complete lack of positive guidance. He had been physically and emotionally abused. He had been in and out of institutions since he was a child. He had been exposed to drugs at a very young age. He had brain damage from meningitis and from years of drug use. All of these factors combined to make him a person who acted on impulse without thinking about the consequences. But even with all of these problems, Gardner was still able to function in certain ways. He was not insane. He understood what he was doing when he committed crimes. He was aware of right and wrong. He simply did not care about the rules or about other people. He had developed an antisocial personality, which meant he could not feel empathy for others, and he had no respect for the law. His time in prison did not change him. It only made him more hardened and more determined to escape. He hated being locked up. He was willing to do whatever it took to get free, even if that meant hurting or killing people. This mindset was already forming in him during his early years behind bars. In August 1984, while still serving his sentence for robbery, Gardner was taken from the prison to the University of Utah Medical Center for a checkup. This was a routine medical visit. He was taken to the hospital with guards watching him. But Gardner was always thinking about escape, and this visit would give him another opportunity. He was ready to take that chance, no matter what it would cost. On August 6, 1984, Ronnie Lee Gardner was taken from the Utah State Prison to the University of Utah Medical Center for a medical checkup. This was a routine visit that happened while he was serving his sentence for robbery. He was accompanied by prison guards who were supposed to watch him at all times. But during the examination, Gardner saw an opportunity. He overpowered one of the guards, stole the guard's pistol, and escaped from the hospital. Before leaving, he also kidnapped an employee of the hospital and forced that person to help him get away. This was his second escape from prison. Now Gardner was on the run again. He had a stolen gun, and he was determined not to be caught. He went into hiding and continued his life of crime. He was free for about 2 months. During this time, he did not try to change his behavior or stay out of trouble. Instead, he began planning more criminal activities. Gardner had a girlfriend at the time named Darcy Perry McCoy. She was involved with him and knew about his criminal plans. Together, they planned a robbery. The target was a bar called Cheers Tavern in Salt Lake City. The plan was simple. Gardner would go into the bar, rob it, and then escape with McCoy waiting outside in a car to drive him away. On October 9, 1984, Gardner went to Cheers Tavern. The bar was open for business, and there was a bartender working that night. His name was Melvin John Otterstrom. Otterstrom was 37 years old. He was a married man with a young son. He worked during the day as a controller at the Utah Paper Box Company, and he worked part-time as a bartender 1 night a week to earn extra money for his family. He was a well-liked man who was described as the glue of his family. He was an Eagle Scout, a former Green Beret, and a graduate of the University of Utah. He was a good man who was simply doing his job that night. Gardner entered the bar with the intention of robbing it. He had his stolen gun with him. Otterstrom was tending the bar when Gardner confronted him. What happened next was not just a robbery. Gardner shot Otterstrom in the face. The bullet went through Otterstrom's skull. The medical examiner later determined that Otterstrom was probably lying on his back on the floor when he was shot. This meant he was already down, possibly after being attacked or forced to the ground, when Gardner fired the fatal shot. Otterstrom died at the scene. After the shooting, Gardner took what he wanted from the bar and fled. Darcy Perry McCoy was waiting outside in the car as planned. She drove Gardner away from the scene. They had escaped together. This was the first murder that Gardner committed, but it would not be the last. For the next few weeks, Gardner remained free. But the police were looking for him. They had identified him as the suspect in Otterstrom's murder. They also knew he was an escaped prisoner. The search continued until November 1984, when Gardner was finally captured and arrested. He was taken back to prison and charged with second-degree murder for killing Otterstrom. While Gardner was back in prison, he was held without bail. The amount set for his bail was $1.5 million, which was a very high amount. He could not pay it, so he remained in custody. He was placed in maximum security because of his violent history and his previous escapes. He was set to face a pretrial hearing in court for the Otterstrom murder charge. On April 2, 1985, Gardner was transported from the Utah State Prison to the Metropolitan Hall of Justice in Salt Lake City. This was the courthouse where his pretrial hearing would take place. He was brought there by prison guards. The guards were supposed to keep him secure and prevent any escape attempts. Gardner was wearing shackles, which are metal restraints used to limit a prisoner's movement. Despite this, he was still thinking about how to get away. As Gardner and his guards entered the basement of the courthouse, a woman approached them. Her name was Karma Jolly Hainsworth. She was the sister of Darcy Perry McCoy, who had helped Gardner escape after the bar murder. Hainsworth walked up to Gardner and handed him a gun. This was no accident. It was a planned move. Hainsworth had also hidden a bag in the women's bathroom in the basement. The bag contained men's clothing, duct tape, and a knife. These items were meant to help Gardner change his appearance and escape more easily. Gardner now had a gun in his hands. He started firing at his guards. The guards fired back at him. During this exchange of gunfire, Gardner was shot through the lung. The bullet caused serious injury to his chest. He was wounded, but he was still able to move. The guards retreated from the area, leaving Gardner alone in the basement with his gun. Gardner was bleeding and in pain, but he did not stop trying to escape. He entered a room in the basement called the Archives Room. This was a room where legal documents were stored. Several people were inside this room at the time. There was a court clerk, a prison officer named Richard Thomas, and 3 attorneys. One of the attorneys was named Robert Macri. Another attorney was named Michael Burdell. Both Macri and Burdell saw Gardner enter the room with a gun. They tried to hide behind the door of the Archives Room to protect themselves. Gardner saw them hiding. He walked toward them with his gun raised. He stopped in front of Macri and pointed the gun at him. Macri was terrified. Gardner cocked the hammer of the gun, which meant he was ready to fire. At that moment, Michael Burdell exclaimed, "Oh my God!" Gardner then turned his gun away from Macri and pointed it at Burdell. He pulled the trigger and shot Burdell in the head. Burdell was hit at close range. He was taken to the hospital for surgery, but he died 45 minutes later. He was 36 years old. After shooting Burdell, Gardner did not stop. He forced the prison officer, Richard Thomas, to lead him out of the Archives Room. Thomas was afraid for his life, so he did what Gardner told him to do. They went to a stairwell that led to the second floor of the courthouse. As Gardner crossed the lobby area, he encountered another person. This was Nicholas G. Kirk, who was known as Nick Kirk. Kirk was a bailiff, which meant he was a court security officer. He was 58 years old at the time. Kirk had just stepped off an elevator when he saw the commotion. He was unarmed, which meant he had no weapon to defend himself. He was only trying to find out what was happening so he could help. Gardner saw Kirk and shot him. The bullet hit Kirk in the lower abdomen. The wound was serious. It tore through his stomach, intestines, bowels, hip, and leg. Kirk survived the shooting, but he would suffer from constant pain and health problems for the rest of his life. Gardner continued moving. He climbed the stairs to the next floor of the courthouse. On that floor, he encountered Wilburn Miller. Miller was a vending machine serviceman. He was just doing his job, restocking machines in the building. Gardner grabbed Miller and took him hostage. He forced Miller to accompany him as he made his way out of the building. When Gardner and Miller reached the outside of the courthouse, Miller saw his chance to escape. He broke free from Gardner and ran away. He dived through a teller's window inside the building to get to safety. Miller was no longer a hostage. Now Gardner was outside the courthouse, alone, wounded, and still carrying his gun. He was surrounded by police officers. There were at least half a dozen officers with their weapons drawn. They ordered him to drop his gun. Gardner looked at the officers. He was outnumbered and wounded. He knew he could not fight his way out. He threw down his gun and lay down on the ground. He surrendered to the officers without any more violence. Gardner was taken to the hospital again to be treated for his gunshot wound. He had been shot through the lung during the exchange of gunfire in the courthouse basement. While he was in the hospital, he was guarded by prison officers to prevent another escape. One of these officers was named Wayne Jorgensen. Gardner spoke to Jorgensen during his recovery. He told the officer that he shot Burdell because he thought Burdell looked as if he would jump on him. He also said he would have killed anyone who tried to stop him from escaping. Gardner had now committed multiple crimes on that single day. He had killed Michael Burdell. He had seriously wounded Nick Kirk. He had taken a hostage. He had attempted to escape from custody. And he had possessed a dangerous weapon while being an incarcerated person. All of these actions happened within a short time on April 2nd, 1985. The gun that Gardner used had been provided by Karma Hainsworth. She had handed it to him in the courthouse basement. The investigation later revealed that she was the one who brought the gun and the escape supplies. She was arrested and charged with aiding an escape. Darcy Perry McCoy, who had helped with the bar murder, was also identified as a suspect in the courthouse escape attempt, but there was not enough evidence to charge her at the time. Gardner was now facing serious charges. He had killed 2 men in separate incidents, Melvin Otterstrom in October 1984 and Michael Burdell in April 1985. He had also wounded Nick Kirk. These were not accidents. Each action was deliberate and planned, even if some parts happened in the chaos of the moment. Gardner knew exactly what he was doing when he fired his gun at each victim. His actions on April 2nd, 1985, were particularly brutal. He had shot and killed a man who was simply trying to hide from him. He had shot and wounded a bailiff who was unarmed and trying to help. He had put many other people in danger, including the guards, the other attorney, the prison officer, and the vending machine serviceman. He had shown no concern for anyone's life except his own. Gardner was returned to prison after he recovered from his wounds. He was placed in maximum security again. He faced a trial for the murder of Michael Burdell. He also faced charges for the attempted murder of Nick Kirk, for aggravated kidnapping of Wilburn Miller, for escape, and for possession of a dangerous weapon by an inmate. The evidence against him was strong. Multiple witnesses had seen him commit the shootings. He had admitted his intentions to a guard. There was no question that he was responsible for these crimes. Ronnie Lee Gardner's trial began in October 1985 at the 3rd District Court in Salt Lake County. The trial was held to determine his guilt for the crimes committed on April 2nd, 1985. The jury had to decide whether Gardner was guilty of first-degree murder for killing Michael Burdell, attempted first-degree murder for shooting Nick Kirk, aggravated kidnapping for taking Wilburn Miller hostage, escape, and possession of a dangerous weapon by an inmate. The trial was conducted in a courtroom that was heavily secured, for plainclothes guards were present at all times. This security was necessary because Gardner had already escaped from custody twice and had shown that he was willing to use violence to get free. The prosecution presented a strong case against Gardner. Multiple witnesses testified about what they had seen in the courthouse basement. Robert Macri testified about how Gardner had pointed the gun at him and then turned and shot Burdell. Prison officer Richard Thomas described how Gardner forced him to lead the way out of the archives room. The evidence showed that Gardner had acted with clear intent. The defense argued that Gardner was in extreme pain and distress after being shot, and that he did not intend to kill Burdell. Gardner himself took the stand to testify in his own defense. He told the jury he was in a daze and could not remember everything that happened. However, the prosecution presented rebuttal testimony from Officer Wayne Jorgensen, who said Gardner had admitted he shot Burdell because he thought Burdell would stop him from escaping. On October 22, 1985, the jury found Gardner guilty of first-degree murder for killing Burdell. He was also convicted of attempted first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, escape, and possession of a dangerous weapon. The jury then moved to the penalty phase of the trial. During this phase, the prosecution presented evidence of Gardner's prior violent acts, including the murder of Melvin Otterstrom. The defense presented testimony from Dr. Peter Heinbecker, a psychiatrist. Dr. Heinbecker had only 24 hours to prepare before testifying. He told the jury that Gardner had grown up in a troubled home, had possible brain damage, and had an antisocial personality disorder. Despite this testimony, the jury deliberated and decided that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating factors. On October 25, 1985, the jury sentenced Ronnie Lee Gardner to death for the murder of Michael Burdell. After the trial, Gardner's attorneys filed appeals. The first appeal went to the Utah Supreme Court. In 1989, the Utah Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and death sentence. The court rejected arguments about pretrial publicity, the judge not stepping aside, the admission of prior convictions, and prosecutorial misconduct. The United States Supreme Court declined to review the case in 1990. Gardner then filed a petition for post-conviction relief in state court. He argued that his trial lawyers had not been effective. A state district court ruled in 1991 that Gardner had not received effective assistance during the sentencing phase because his lawyers had not given the psychiatrist enough time to prepare. The court ordered a new penalty hearing. However, the Utah Supreme Court reversed this decision in 1994. The court ruled that there was no prejudice to Gardner, meaning the lack of preparation did not change the outcome. The United States Supreme Court again declined to review the case in 1995. During the years he spent on death row, Gardner continued to be a problem in prison. In September 1994, he attacked and stabbed another inmate with a homemade knife. The other inmate survived the attack, but Gardner showed that he was still violent even behind bars. On another occasion, he broke down a glass partition in the prison visiting room, barricaded the door, and had sex with his half-brother's wife while prison officers looked on helplessly. These incidents showed that Gardner was not reformed and that he still posed a danger to others. Gardner's legal team continued to fight his death sentence. They filed a federal habeas petition in 1997. They argued that his trial counsel had been ineffective in several ways. They also raised issues about a faulty jury instruction. Over the next several years, the case moved through the federal courts. In 2009, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld his conviction and sentence. The court found that the Utah Supreme Court had not been unreasonable in rejecting his claims. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal again in March 2010. On April 23, 2010, Judge Robin Reese signed a death warrant. This was a formal order that set Gardner's execution date for June 18, 2010. At that hearing, Gardner was asked how he wanted to die. Under Utah law at the time, inmates sentenced before 2004 could choose between lethal injection and firing squad. Gardner told the judge, "I would like the firing squad, please." He made this choice because he believed it was a more humane way to die. Gardner's attorneys made one last attempt to save his life. They asked the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole to commute his sentence to life in prison without parole. They presented evidence of Gardner's troubled childhood. They also brought forward affidavits from 3 of the jurors who had sentenced him. These jurors said that if they had known about his childhood, they would have given him life without parole instead of death. 3 of the victims' families spoke at the hearing. Donna Taylor, the niece of Michael Burdell, said her family opposed the death penalty. She said her uncle would not have wanted Gardner to die. Jason Otterstrom, the son of Melvin Otterstrom, said his family needed peace and asked the board to let Gardner's execution proceed. The board voted unanimously against commutation. They decided that the death sentence should stand. Gardner's attorneys then asked Governor Gary Herbert to grant a stay of execution. The governor denied this request on June 17, 2010. He said that all of Gardner's claims had already been considered by the courts. Later that same day, the U.S. Supreme Court also denied a last-minute appeal. There were no more legal options left. On the night of June 17, 2010, Gardner was moved to an observation cell. He spent his final hours sleeping, reading a novel called Divine Justice, and watching the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy. He also met with a bishop from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He had chosen to fast from food for the 36 hours before his death, drinking only liquids. His last meal had been eaten 2 days earlier: steak, lobster tail, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and 7-Up. His family gathered outside the prison to support him, but they did not witness the execution because Gardner did not want them to see him being shot. Just after midnight on June 18, 2010, Gardner was taken to the execution chamber. He was strapped to a black metal chair. A target was placed over his heart. A black hood was placed over his head. 5 volunteer executioners stood about 25 feet away behind a wall with a gun port. Each had a .30 caliber Winchester rifle. One of the rifles contained a blank round, so no shooter knew if they had fired the fatal shot. Gardner was asked if he had any last words. He said, "I do not know." The countdown began. The shooters fired at the count of 2. 4 bullets struck Gardner in the chest. He was pronounced dead at 12:17 a.m. on June 18, 2010. He was 49 years old. Gardner became the 1,217th person executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. He was the 7th person executed in Utah since that time, and the 3rd to die by firing squad. His execution was the first by firing squad in Utah in 14 years. After his death, his family released balloons and played the song "Free Bird" by Lynyrd Skynyrd. They said they were glad he was free. Attorney General Mark Shurtleff said that Gardner would never kill or assault anyone again. The families of his victims expressed a range of emotions. Some felt relief that it was finally over. Others, like Michael Burdell's family, had opposed the execution and felt sadness that Gardner had to die. The victims of Gardner's crimes never fully recovered from what he did to them. Melvin Otterstrom died instantly on October 9, 1984, leaving behind a wife and a 3-year-old son. Nick Kirk survived the shooting on April 2, 1985, but he lived in constant pain for the next 11 years. He could no longer enjoy the activities he loved, like fishing and bowling. He died of a heart attack in 1996 at the age of 69. His wife believes he would have lived longer if Gardner had not shot him. Michael Burdell died on the day of the shooting at the age of 36. He left behind a fiancée and a large family that still missed him 25 years later. Gardner's actions had destroyed multiple lives and caused pain that lasted for decades. After Gardner's execution, the story of his life and crimes was finally closed. He had spent nearly 25 years on death row, from 1985 until 2010. All of his appeals had been exhausted. His choice to die by firing squad had brought worldwide attention to Utah, and to the methods of execution used in the United States. But in the end, the execution did not bring back the men he had killed. It did not undo the suffering he had caused to his victims and their families. It simply marked the end of Ronnie Lee Gardner's violent life and his long journey through the criminal justice system.